Good evening and welcome. I'm so glad everyone is here to join us tonight. I think we're expecting a large crowd for part 2 of our Hamilton series. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I would just like to introduce myself. My name is Kayla Del Biondo, and I'm coordinator of programming and outreach at New Canaan Library. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Gil Harel, and I'm sure a lot of you have tuned into his programs in person pre-COVID and virtually last week, hopefully. And if you didn't watch his talk last week, that is now uploaded on the library's YouTube channel, so go check it out. But Gil is a musicologist and music theorist whose interests include styles ranging from Western classical repertoire to jazz. Previously, he has served on the faculty at CUNY Baruch College, where he was awarded the prestigious Presidential Excellence Award for Distinguished Teaching, as well as the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics in Chengdu, China. Currently, Gil teaches at Naugatuck Valley Community College, where he was presented with the Merit Award for Exemplary Service to the college. At NVCC, Dr. Harel conducts the College Chorale, an a cappella ensemble. He also teaches music history and theory and serves as musical director of theater productions. Outside of teaching, he enjoys staying active as a pianist and vocalist. Gil, thank you for being with us tonight for part 2 of your lecture. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kayla, for that introduction. And thank you to the many folks who have joined us on this webinar to dive into the score of Hamilton. Of course, we're talking about Act 2 tonight. And last week, if you recall, we talked about some of the salient aspects of this monumental landmark watershed piece. We talked about the medium of rap and hip hop, which enables composer and the lyricist Lin Manuel Miranda to suffuse this work with a greater volume of text than could ever be contained in a traditional musical. In fact, not that we should put much stock in this sort of thing, but if you did happen to look at the page count for the score of this musical, it's close to 600 pages of musical score, which is a staggering number, and it tells us a lot about, again, that volume of text I alluded to just now. We talked last week about the plot of Act 1, and in doing so, we covered the inherent excitement that's built into the plot, which covers the Revolutionary War period. We said that when covering such an incendiary topic, something with so many combustible elements, including a love triangle between Alexander, Eliza, and Angelica, Lin Manuel Miranda is able to keep the action flowing, even though Act 1 is quite long by musical standards. It's well over an hour long. And some might say, well, isn't that par for the course? The first act is typically longer than the second act. However, the second act is also substantial and quite a bit takes place in it. So without further ado, we're going to get into it. What we'll see musically in Act 2 is a technique known as leitmotif. Now, some of you might be familiar with this term. A leitmotif in music refers to a fragment of notes, a cell of sorts, that refers or recalls or alludes to a very specific person, place, or thing, or idea. This idea was not created by Lin Manuel Miranda, but he uses it exceptionally skillfully in this musical particularly. And I think it works really well in a musical of such scope because we need something as listeners that's going to sort of root us orally to all of the characters and events that are transpiring on stage. Now, to further complicate things, we have a number of characters who are double cast. That is to say, they come back in Act 2, the actors, as completely different characters with either some faint echo of a relation to their previous incarnation or perhaps no connection whatsoever. The best example of this would be the character of Thomas Jefferson, who opens Act 2, who's played by the very same actor who plays the Marquis de Lafayette in Act 1. So we call this double casting, and in this case, the actor who originated that role was Daveed Diggs, and we'll get to hear him on the original Broadway cast recording. So we have these leitmotifs, these fragments of musical ideas that come back and they circle round in a sort of a recursive way to connect us to some of the events that transpired in Act 1. We'll see that fairly early on in our program this evening. I think we'll have time to look at perhaps 5 or maybe even 6 numbers from Act 2. I would suggest that whereas Act 1 tackles the subject of the Revolutionary War, Act 2 really is split in 2 directions. Number 1 would be the growing political rivalries of Alexander Hamilton and the many antagonists, or at least I should say the people who become antagonists in this particular story. And that includes Thomas Jefferson to a large degree, but of course, as we know from the history books, the main foil here, the main antagonist, although I think we'll be able to make an argument by the end of tonight that perhaps he shouldn't be labeled as such would be Aaron Burr. We met Aaron Burr last week when we looked at some of his peculiar qualities as they're presented in the musical. We might describe him as an evasive, somewhat shady character even, someone who, as opposed to Hamilton, who wears his heart on his sleeve and is not afraid to make assertions and articulate his convictions with great pride and even ferocity. We see that Aaron Burr is somewhat of a cagey politician who is not so quick to divulge his true feelings. That's going to come to a head in Act Two, and that's going to be one of the major sparks that leads to this combustible eruption at the end, which in terms of the historicity of this story is very much rooted in fact. We know, for example, that in 1804, while he was, of all things, serving as vice president of the United States, Aaron Burr shot and killed Alexander Hamilton, hit him with a bullet between the ribs in Weehawken, New Jersey. Now, the fact that this transpired is no surprise. I think most people associate the fate of Hamilton with this monumental event that transpired early in the morning over there in Weehawken. What many people don't recognize or remember is that Aaron Burr was the sitting vice president of the United States at the time. Can you imagine Kamala Harris shooting somebody in a duel? You know, as acrimonious as our political arena can sometimes be, I think we would all agree that the early 1800s, things were quite different. All right, as Kayla suggested, I'm going to invite everybody to put their comments and questions in the Q&A function, or rather put the comments in the chat perhaps and the questions in the Q&A, and I'll be pausing periodically to address and answer those questions. So let's talk about how Act Two begins. To do that, we should just jog our memories a bit and remember how Act One ended. Act One ends with a tour de force called Nonstop, actually the longest song in the show, and it involves all of the characters we've met throughout the act, including Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, Eliza, Angelica. The entire cast, the entire company comes out and sing this song Nonstop, which very specifically refers to the industrious nature of Alexander Hamilton. And this is something that's emphasized in the Ron Chernow biography. For those who haven't read it, I would suggest checking it out. Last week, I think that Anthony said the library has a few copies. So go ahead and check out the Ron Chernow biography from 2004. If you haven't read it, you should read it because it's an excellent read. And really, you don't take my word for it. Just think of the fact that that book was the sort of ontological genesis of this musical comes from that book. And it's such a good read, such a compelling story, so expertly told by the author that Lin Manuel Miranda decided to turn this into a musical. Of course, we wouldn't be here this evening without that book. So I would humbly suggest that you go check the book out. Literally check it out of the library. At any rate, one thing that's emphasized throughout the book is the industrious nature of Alexander Hamilton, how incredibly productive he was, like a dynamo. Nowadays, we might suggest that he was something on the order of a workaholic, but that doesn't quite cover it. It wasn't just that he was motivated to do work. It was that his mind was a fertile wellspring of ideas that poured forth incessantly. And fortunately for posterity, Hamilton committed many of those ideas, took his crow-quill pen and committed those ideas to paper. So we have them preserved. And so the industrious nature of this incredibly hyperactive mind has been chronicled and documented by historians and scholars, and is something that is really the focus of Act One. That Burr sort of is speaking both to Hamilton and to himself and to no one in particular. How do you write like you're running out of time? How do you write as if tomorrow is not guaranteed for you? This idea that Hamilton is working at a pace that cannot be matched, it cannot be equaled, is something that's going to fuel the resentment and the bitterness of Aaron Burr specifically. And it's something that even his greatest foes, as we'll see in the last number, are going to profoundly admire about the man even after he's dead, long dead and gone. So that's how Act One ends. Act Two begins with a return from Paris, from France, of Thomas Jefferson. And he's returned from France, where he's been serving as on a diplomatic mission there through most of the 1780s. It's well known to historians that Thomas Jefferson was what we would now call a Francophile, somebody who had a deep affection and reverence and veneration for French culture. Of course, he spoke French fluently. He admired the ideals that would lead to the French Revolution in 1789. Remember that there is a dotted line to be drawn here. The American Revolution breaks out, and it's not much longer until the French Revolution breaks out in August of 1789. So there are connections here, and certainly I think if we were to place any one historical figure on that dotted line, it should be Thomas Jefferson, because of his connection both to the philosophers and ideologues, and you might even say the activists who were prominent in France, and then of course his role in American politics, starting really in the 1780s and certainly expanding into the 1790s and really reaching their apogee in the election of 1800, where he is elected the third president of the United States. I mentioned that Aaron Burr was vice president under him. That's true. The two of them did not really get along. Jefferson was highly suspicious of Burr, and some might not know this, but the convention back in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, when Hamilton was elected, was that the runner-up, if you will, in the presidential election became vice president. Now, this is almost inconceivable to us today. Can you imagine that? Imagine if the various parties that contended for the presidency, if the party that came in second in the election had to serve or got to serve in some secondary ancillary role in government, or even as high up as vice president. In other words, can you conceive of a reality where Joe Biden is president and Donald Trump is vice president, or vice versa for that matter? I think this is kind of inconceivable to a modern thinker today, those of us who follow the news and follow politics, which I would imagine is just about everybody. This sort of reality is something that we can only fathom in the recesses of our imagination. But welcome to America 200 plus years ago, where vice presidents could shoot and kill people in a duel and not even be tried, but then later be arrested for being implicated in a really crackpot conspiracy theory, where this is called the Burr conspiracy. You can read about that. That was several years, I think 1807, when Burr was later arrested. So he shoots and kills Hamilton in 1804, nothing happens. And then a few years later, he was arrested for supposedly conspiring to start his own rival nation in the frontier lands. Of course, he was acquitted. That never happened, but it led to a very bitter period of self-imposed exile and expatriation. And when Burr did finally come back to the States to restart his law career, it was just a disaster, miserable for him. He remarried at a very late age and divorced, if you can believe it. And then he had a stroke, and Aaron Burr's life really ended up horribly. And in some ways, though all of the privation and misfortune that Alexander Hamilton suffered, I think you could make the case that really Burr had it worse in many ways. Okay. So let's talk about the first song in Act 2. We're introduced to Thomas Jefferson. Let's see how the composer does that. Well, first, we'll look at the bass notes. Now, an astute observer, somebody who's really, really good at music theory, perhaps, or even not, doesn't have to be really good, but at least paying attention, would notice that Act 2 starts in the exact same key as Act 1, the key of B minor, with the same exact bass notes. Again, you don't have to be a trained musician to hear that. My sense is that most people, if they juxtaposed What Did I Miss, the opener of Act 2, with Alexander Hamilton, the opener of Act 1, you would recognize that there are very acute similarities in the music between the two. Again, this is part of that recursive technique that I talked about earlier, where the composer is clearly bringing back musical fragments and elements that are meant to jog the memory of the listener and conjure up something that is perhaps, in this case, sort of one of the universal themes of this show. And this bass line is really associated with Hamilton's narrative, I suppose I would say. The year is given, 1780, almost like they're stuttering, 1789. We get more of this recursive idea as Burr raps some of the lyrics he sang at the very beginning. Now, some of you know the opening lines of Hamilton because, well, they're not so NSFW. This is not the sort of thing that we would say in front of children, perhaps. How does a bastard orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman? That's not exactly the nicest language. Of course, it could be far more vulgar, but it's still, the word bastard here is a reference to Hamilton's lineage, his parents, specifically his father's role in his life, and not to his personality. There are people, for example, when you read about the conquest of the Norman conquest of England in 1066, you'll read about William the Bastard. And of course, that was also a reference to his parentage and not to his personality. Anyway, so we get this recursive technique of lyrics brought back by the same narrator, Aaron Burr. But now it's different. The rhythm is different. It has more of a bounce to it. It's swung. And that's going to anticipate the style of What Did I Miss, which is primarily written in a jazz style, although there are really two different sections of this jazz style. So I think what we'll do is we'll listen to it, and then I'll talk about those two different styles and why I think the composer chose to introduce Thomas Jefferson in such a way. Jefferson is one of the important characters in Act Two. So clearly starting the act and bringing in this very, very monumentally important character who is perhaps one of the best known figures in the history of the nascent United States of America. It's very important. So it's clearly the composer is going to put a lot of stock in the music here. Let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like.
1789. How does the bastard, orphan, immigrant, decorated war vet unite the colonies through more debt? Fight the other founding fathers till he has to forfeit. Have it all, lose it all. You ready for more yet? Treasury Secretary, Washington's the president. Every American experiment sets a precedent. Not so fast, someone came along to resist him. Pissed him off until we had a two-party system. You haven't met him yet, you haven't had the chance, cause he's been kicking ass as the ambassador to France. But someone's gotta keep the American promise. You simply must meet Thomas. Thomas Jefferson's coming home. 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 Lord, he's been off in Paris for so long. France is following us to revolution. There is no more status quo. But the sun comes up and the world still spins. I helped Lafayette draft a declaration. Then I said I gotta go. I gotta be in Monticello. Now the work at home begins. So what did I miss? What did I miss? Virginia, my home, sweet home, I wanna give you a kiss. I've been in Paris meeting lots of different ladies. I guess I basically missed the late 80s. I traveled the wide, wide world and came back to this. There's a letter on my desk from the president. Haven't even put my bag down yet. Sally, BLM, darling, won't you open it? It says the president's assembled in a cabinet, and then I end up being the Secretary of State. Great, and I'm already sending approved. I just got home and now I'm headed up to New York. Headed to New York, headed to New York. Looking at the rolling fields, I can't believe that we are free. Ready to face whatever's awaiting me in NYC. But who's waiting for me when I step into place? My friend James Madison, red in the face. He grabs my arm and I respond, what's going on? Thomas, we are engaged in a battle for our nation's very soul. Can you get us out of the mess we're in? Hamilton's new financial plan is nothing less than government control. I've been fighting for the South alone. Where have you been? France. We have to win. Well, what did I miss? What did I miss? What did I miss? Come home to this. Head first into a political abyss. Head first into the abyss. I had my first cabinet
Jefferson, welcome home.
Mr. Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton.
Mr. Jefferson, welcome home. Mr. Jefferson, welcome home, sir. You've been off in Paris for so long.
So what did I miss?
Now, some might say that this music sounds almost comical at times. Does it not? There's an edge of humor here in the personality of Thomas Jefferson. And a lot of that, of course, is tied up with the actor who originated the role of Daveed Diggs, who I think some people would say steals the show in many cases. And whenever he's on stage, his magnetic, charismatic personality really compels our attention as listeners and as viewers. One particular aspect of his presentation, which we didn't see here because we're just looking at the score with some audio, is that he walks out when the tempo is slower in the beginning, before the what I'll call a boogie woogie bass line, this bass line that we might associate with, say a Count Basie, or even a Fats Waller, this kind of arpeggiated bass line, which is going to evoke jazz from the 1930s, from the swing era, from the big band era. I think that Miranda gives him this music specifically to kind of suggest that the character of Thomas Jefferson is a crafty wheeler dealer. He sort of is an amalgam of Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, in that he possesses a really tremendous intellect, but he's also a really cagey politician, and he's also a very productive and sort of goal-driven. He understands, he has his pulse or his finger on the pulse of the political system in a way that Aaron Burr never did. As we'll see when we get to the end of Act 2, Aaron Burr, as I mentioned earlier, sort of died in miserable circumstances, suffering from all sorts of privation. He had been broke for a while. He'd been arrested. He'd been in a sort of self-imposed exile, living in Europe as an expatriate, whereas Thomas Jefferson is this celebrated figure whose legacy has, I shouldn't say it's not been tarnished at all. After all, last summer, we know that there were some people trying to pull down statues of some of these figures. However, to a large degree, I would say that Thomas Jefferson is a revered figure in American politics and American history. And giving him this sort of smooth, jazzy music emphasizes this perception that he's crafty, he's a wheeler dealer, he's charismatic, he's smooth, I suppose you'd say. And Daveed Diggs really plays this up. In fact, when you watch this performance, which you can watch on Disney Plus, I'm sure many of you have, you see he walks out at the slower tempo, kind of walking almost sideways, and he's holding, of all things, a cane. And you might think, well, did the historical Thomas Jefferson walk with a cane in 1789? And the answer is, of course not. In fact, even when he was president, Thomas Jefferson was known for his emphasis on physical fitness and was known to take very long walks and to promote exercise and cardiovascular health and such. So why is he walking with a cane? Well, Daveed Diggs was asked about this in an interview. If the historical Thomas Jefferson never walked with a cane in this period, why is your character walking with a cane? And his answer may not make sense at first, but I think it requires us to sort of plug ourselves in a little bit in a sort of anthropological way to the urban community. Remember, when Lin Manuel Miranda created Hamilton, and when it was presented to the world, it was presented with mostly people of color playing the prominent roles of, well, of course, Hamilton and Jefferson and Burr and Washington and so on. And what Miranda famously said about that, some of you will have heard this quote, he said, "It's America then told by America now." So when he was asked, to get back to the story, Daveed Diggs was asked, why walk out with a cane and sort of walk in a lopsided fashion? And he described it as, of all things, the term is a pimp walk. Now, why would Thomas Jefferson's character have the quality of a pimp here? And the way Diggs explained it, and there are interviews you can find where he talks about this, that Jefferson is clearly asserting his authority, but he's doing it not in the draconian authoritarian way that George III does it when he sings "You'll Be Back" in Act 1. Here it's kind of with a knowing, sardonic smile and this silky music that is, I think, irresistible. As listeners, we can't help but tap our foot to it and find Thomas Jefferson to be a remarkably charismatic character already. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about what else happens in Act Two? We're introduced to Jefferson. I mentioned that much of Act Two deals with the, shall we say, the escalating tension between Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, and James Madison. And on the other side of the aisle, of course, you've got Alexander Hamilton, and for a time in Act Two, at least until his big farewell speech, George Washington. So, you know, you heard it alluded to there. There's a couple of lines in the text that kind of point us to some really interesting aspects of the political arena of this period. For example, did you notice the line, you haven't met him yet because he's been, you know, you haven't had a chance because he's been kicking butt as the ambassador to France. And then it says about Hamilton, pissed him off until we had a two-party system. So the bicameral system is going to be, many historians would say, is based, in fact, rooted in this rivalry between Jefferson and Hamilton and the two ideological stances they took, which were in opposition often. And basically that can be summed up as Hamilton advocating for a very strong centralized federal government and Thomas Jefferson advocating for more of a state-driven format. And honestly, I think it's important to point out that a lot of these antithetical viewpoints, a lot of that still pervades politics today. And I don't want to get into contemporary politics, the last thing I want to talk about now, but it just shows you the impact of this particular rivalry. So that's part of Act Two. The other part of Act Two is more salacious. Of course, many of you know what I'm talking about. It's the Reynolds affair. And there's a couple of songs in the show that deal with the Reynolds affair. We'll listen to two of them. The Reynolds affair took place in the 1790s, and we know a lot about it, or at least we know what Alexander Hamilton says happened, because he wrote about it extensively. And this was one of the first sex scandals in American politics, filled with all sorts of lubricious details, with all sorts of prurient minutiae that Hamilton went into detail writing and composing this voluminous text describing it. And this is especially bizarre because the man was married with children at the time, and his political career had never looked better than it did in the 1790s. He was enormously popular in some circles. He was enormously influential. And as we know from the musical there, the song Hamilton's Right, he was Washington's right-hand man. We know that during the war, he was his aide-de-camp. Later on, he's going to serve as Secretary of the Treasury. And yet the Reynolds pamphlet is going to more or less destroy his political career. And I would suggest ultimately lead to that fateful confrontation in, well, you remember it, Weehawken, New Jersey. So next up, we're going to look at the cabinet battle. You have to love these cabinet battles. I think for some fans of Hamilton, even though they're shorter movements, these are some of the most beloved moments in the entire musical. Now, we were just talking about the ideological opposition between Hamilton, who advocated for a strong centralized government, federalism essentially, and Thomas Jefferson, who's advocating for more autonomous control, agency given to the states. Well, this is going to be articulated through a debate, through a sort of a verbal confrontation. And Miranda cleverly, very cleverly, I would say, decides to put this particular debate in the hip hop style with this loop theme that comes in E minor, very high up in the piano, and these very low bass notes. And it's almost like, to me, the way I hear it is, imagine you're in an urban setting and you've got sort of, you know, the Jets and the Sharks on either side, and they're getting ready to rumble. And the way I hear this is you've got the really low bass notes, the really high notes here in the synth, and then you've got in the middle the combatants, in this case Hamilton and Jefferson. The lyrics here are very clever and a testament to the composer's facility with prose. Let's listen to the cabinet battle, and then we'll move on later into the act. So you can see here, it begins with Washington calling the meeting to order, but actually the way the text comes out, it's suggested that we could be anywhere on an urban playground or in a nightclub or in a totally different venue than a political, a house of political discourse, a traditional house of political discourse. Here's cabinet battle number 1. if I told you that you were going to watch a musical that was about states' rights and federalism and the consolidation of national debt and the fiscal banking system, I think most people would be hesitant, to say the least. And yet, something about this style, something about this musical medium, something about, of course, the very talented, charismatic, and compelling acting that's taking place during this scene, all the others, all of a sudden makes these rather prosaic and somewhat lofty and perhaps on paper not so interesting ideas become far more magnetic, far more interesting than they ever would be if you were reading about it, say, in a textbook. And I know many faculty members on the college level who love to use Hamilton to teach not just history or music for that matter, but to teach any number of disciplines because it is just such a great pedagogical tool for doing any number of things, from writing an English essay, if you want to come up with a compelling thesis and a powerful exposition and a sort of a middle narrative and the third chapter and then wrap it up. Or if you're trying to teach somebody about economics and the history of economics in this country, this is a great way to do so, and therefore this musical has tremendous pedagogical value. So we've now talked about how Act Two focuses on this rivalry that's developing between Hamilton and his antipodes in the government, namely Jefferson and, of course, Aaron Burr. What about his personal life? Well, if you remember what happens at the end of Act One, during Nonstop, there's an interlude towards the end, and George Washington shows up. And George Washington says, "I need you by my side. I know I'm asking a lot from you." And before he can even finish the question, what does Hamilton say? Treasury or state? Very telling. What it suggests to us, at least in the musical, is that the character Alexander Hamilton, even though he's married and he's got children and more on the way, he sort of can't wait to go off and serve as Secretary of the Treasury. He wants to be in the cabinet because, as the musical suggests, and I think this is backed up by the scholarship, Alexander Hamilton had a bit of an ego, and with his degree of intellect, I think he understood that he was going to make an impact in history, and he was going to be a mover and a shaker and an influencer. And what we learn at the end of Act One is, as soon as Washington even plants the seeds of the question, Hamilton has the answer ready. He's ready to go off. And of course, this leads to a minor confrontation with Eliza. Eliza says, "Well, wait a second, you just got home from fighting in the war. Now you're leaving again?" And Hamilton's response is always something to the effect of, "My work requires it. I need to be there. I'm of paramount importance here. I can't leave it to anyone else. It's got to be me." Well, this is obviously going to have a detrimental impact on his marriage, and that's one of the themes that runs through Act Two, starting with the song "Take a Break" and culminating with the song "Burn." There's a lot that happens in between there, but I think what we'll do now is we'll take a look at the song "Take a Break," which segues directly into "Say No to This." So we'll listen to "Take a Break," and then we'll pause, get a window into Hamilton's life, discuss it a bit, and then we'll talk about the song that comes next. It's not a coincidence that there's a direct segue from "Take a Break" into "Say No to This." Before we listen to "Say No to This," we'll want to talk about it and establish a sort of a little bit of a foundation for understanding what's happening, both in the musical, but also understanding where fact diverges from fiction, or fiction diverges from fact, and where we get some poetic liberties taken in the libretto. Not everything about what we're going to hear is historically accurate, but I should say that for the most part, quite a bit of it is. Here's "Take a Break." We're going to go ahead and share screens. You'll notice it starts with Eliza counting in French. Now, why would she be counting in French? What does that have to do with anything? In fact, it's sort of ironic, right? Because Alexander Hamilton has just insulted Jefferson for being a Francophile. "Don't talk to me about the war. We almost died in the trench while you were off getting high with the French," is, I'm paraphrasing the line there. She's, of course, counting in French because in the late 18th century, this was considered a mark of sophistication in the inchoate United States of America. And I think to this day, something about the French language smacks of sophistication and education and ambition and the like. In fact, in the late 18th century and throughout the Baroque period into the Enlightenment period, and really in the Rococo and the late Enlightenment period, speaking French was considered to be a mark of sophistication and intellect and one's place in high society. It was also, by the way, expected that at least for the daughters of the aristocracy, you should have a little bit of French, a little bit of needlework, but also a little bit of piano. So what you'll notice in this number is that this little window into the Hamilton family is actually quite charming. It starts with Eliza coaching her oldest son, Philip Hamilton, who, as many of you know, would also die, of all places, in Weehawken, New Jersey, of all times, in 1803, a year before his father was shot and killed, more or less in the same spot. But here she is, and Philip's a child, and she's teaching him how to count in French. I think those of us who have children probably can remember that moment where we beam with pride when our children count and they get to 10 or whatever their target is. And some of you may be familiar with, not necessarily with French, but just the idea of teaching a second language. And I know I'm doing this with my daughter right now, and she mixes and matches different languages because she's learning. Obviously, she knows the English. She's learning it in Hebrew. She's learning it in German. And it's a lot for her, but she's doing great. She's doing great. At any rate, this scene has taken on new meaning for me ever since I had my oldest daughter, who's now 2 years and a couple of months, and she loves nothing more than counting. So not only do we have the counting, but we also have an allusion to Philip studying a little bit of music. This is really par for the course for a family of this pedigree. And remember that even though Alexander Hamilton, as we learned last week, was born more or less in penury and grew up with a great deal of privation in his life, he's going to marry into one of the rich families of the New York elite, into the Schuyler family. And so therefore it makes perfect sense that his son would be getting coached in music and in French. But the reason we're going to look at this song is because it sort of sets the stage for what comes later in the act. Here is Take a Break.
Good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 7, 8, 9. 7, 8, 9. 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Some of you may have noticed that the music here is in the texture that we call polyphonic. It's not a fugue exactly, or even a fugato for that matter, but it does involve imitation, which is a very sort of Baroque thing. It's a very 18th century musical thing to encounter, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to include it in this scene, although it is a little bit anachronistic for the 1790s. This would have been a slightly earlier style. Now the style changes completely, and we get music that many of you will recognize from Act 1, because it's essentially the music from Angelica's big number in Act 1. That number is called Satisfied. Here the Satisfied music comes back because we're witnessing a sort of a conversation across the sea as Hamilton writes a letter to Angelica, and she later reads it.
My dearest Angelica, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. I trust you'll understand the reference to another Scottish tragedy without my having to name the play. They think me Macbeth, ambition is my folly. I'm a polymath, a pain in the ass, a massive pain. Madison is Banquo, Jefferson's Macduff, and Burnham Wood is Congress on its way to Dunsinane. And there you are an ocean away. Do you have to live an ocean away? Thoughts of you subside, then I get another letter, and I cannot put the notion away.
Take a break.
I'm on my way.
There's a little surprise before supper, and it cannot wait.
I'll be there in just a minute, save my plate.
Alexander,
Okay.
your son is 9 years old today. He has something he'd like to say. He's been practicing all day. Philip, take it away.
Daddy, look, my name is Philip. I am a poet. I wrote this poem just to show it. And I just turned 9. You can write rhymes, but you can't write mine.
What?
I practice French and play piano with my mother. I have a sister, but I want a little brother.
Okay.
My daddy's trying to start America's bank. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Take a break.
Hey, our kid is pretty great.
Run away with us
got so much on my plate.
We can all go stay with my father. There's a lake I know in a nearby park.
I love to go.
You and I can go when the night gets dark.
I will try to get away.
My dearest Alexander, you must get through to Jefferson. Sit down with him and compromise. Don't stop till you agree. Your favorite older sister, Angelica, reminds you there's someone in your corner all the way across the sea. In a letter I received from you 2 weeks ago, I noticed a comma in the middle of a phrase. It changed the meaning. Did you intend this? One stroke and you've consumed my waking days. It says, my dearest Angelica, with a comma after dearest. You've written, my dearest Angelica. Anyway, all this to say, I'm coming home this summer at my sister's invitation. I'll be there with your family if you make your way upstate. I know you're very busy, I know your work's important, but I'm crossing the ocean and I just can't wait. You won't be an ocean away, you'll only be a moment away. Alexander, come downstairs. Angelica's arriving today. Angelica, Eliza,
The Schuyler sisters.
Alexander.
Hi.
It's good to see your face. Angelica, tell this man John Adams spends the summer with his family.
Angelica, tell my wife John Adams doesn't have a real job anyway.
You're not joining us, wait.
I'm afraid I cannot join you upstate.
Alexander, I came all this way. She came all this way. All this way, take a break.
You know I have to get my plan through Congress.
Run away with us for the summer, let's go upstate.
I lose my job if we don't get this plan through Congress.
All go stay with our father. There's a lake I know. I'll miss your face. Screw your courage to the sticking plate. I can go. Eliza, right, take a break and get away. Run away with us for the summer, let's go upstate. Where we can stay. We can all go stay with our father. If you take your time, I'll make your mind right. Close your eyes and dream when the night gets dark. Take a break.
I have to get my plan through Congress. I can't stop till I get this plan through Congress.
This is a great example of what we call a half cadence. It's not even a half cadence. This is a cadence that's completely left up in the air. It makes it very clear, even if you don't have the score in front of you, this can't possibly be the end of the scene. The segue, of course, tells us that we're going into the second half of this, I suppose I would call it the antecedent and the consequent. So there's a lot of interesting things that take place here. Obviously, most of the music is based on Angelica's leitmotif because, as we learned in Act 1, Angelica went off and married someone by the name of Church. And actually, she was married to him in the late 1770s. They actually eloped, the historical Angelica. But in the musical, she goes off to England and she exchanges these very intimate letters with Alexander Hamilton. And that's really emphasized here when she talks about my dearest, comma, Angelica, suggesting that Alexander is addressing her in this very intimate way. What else we see here in this number is Hamilton's commitment to his work. The fact that he has no, there's my daughter's adding her own notes to the soundtrack. The sense that one gets from Alexander here is that he is such a workaholic. He's so type A, I guess a later generation would say, that he can't pry himself away from his work. He can't even go upstate for this lovely summer holiday. So what's the consequence of that? The consequence is that he's going to go and put his nose to the proverbial grindstone. He's going to try to get his work done. And yet he's all alone. Remember, his wife and family are upstate. They're near the Schuyler estate up in the bucolic paradise of upstate New York. Those of you who have ever been to Saratoga Springs have no doubt seen the signs for the nearby town of Schuylerville, named after the very same family. So the Hamilton family has gone upstate, and they're They're enjoying the summer holiday, but Alexander is spending these steamy days slaving away, trying to massage his plan for a federal banking system through Congress. And what's going to happen? Well, this is where the musical takes some poetic liberties, but actually much of it is rooted in fact. Here's what we know. We know that sometime around 1791, Alexander met a woman in her early 20s. He would have been in his mid-30s, 34, I believe, at the time. He's going to meet someone by the name of Maria, but here addressed as Maria Reynolds. And she says to him, "Sir, can you help me? I'm in trouble. I don't have any money. My husband's just been absolutely brutal to me. I have nowhere to go and nowhere to turn to. Can you help?" So Alexander grabs some cash. He goes back to her boarding house. He gives her the cash, and then he realizes that it's not going to end simply with an exchange of money. He's going to go to bed with her. This is where the story becomes rather salacious, rather prurient, rather lubricious. Choose your adjective here. But the story is going to get rather sordid, rather dirty. Now, how do we know all of these details? We know because Hamilton's later going to write about them. The story is that he meets this woman and he goes to bed with her. And then after a few months of this affair unfolding, he receives a letter from, of all people, her husband. Now, of course, he knew she was married, but then again, he himself was married at the time, so he doesn't have a moral compunction about going to sleep with a married woman, because after all, he's under the impression that the husband is this draconian brute who treats her so poorly that she comes to him because he offers her succor, in addition to money, obviously. So what happens next? Well, James Reynolds, who's her husband, says, "Listen, you have been sleeping with my wife. There's a great line here. Uh-oh, it's time to pay the piper. You made the wrong, you made the wrong sucker a cuckold. It's time to pay the piper for the pants that you unbuckled," which that's very clever writing. I don't know how many of you would come up with something half as clever as that. I know I certainly couldn't, rhyming the word cuckold with unbuckled, but there you have it. So James Reynolds is going to start to blackmail and extort money from Hamilton. Later on in the affair, Hamilton is going to keep sleeping with Maria Reynolds, if you can believe it, while he's paying substantial sums to James Reynolds, hundreds of dollars, totaling something like $1,300. You can imagine how much money that was in the mid-1790s. Now, here's where things get really interesting. James Reynolds is going to be arrested sometime later for something completely unrelated. He was involved in a plot to embezzle money that was going to be paid out to veterans of the Revolutionary War. So what does he do when he's arrested? Well, many of you see where this is going. If you're James Reynolds, and we get the impression that this guy is a low-life scumbag in the musical and in real life, and you're arrested and you're in deep trouble, what are you going to do? You're going to try to leverage your position as best you can. So what do you have that you can possibly offer to the authorities? How about some dirt on a man who would have been at that point not only a bitter political rival, but also perceived as a profound threat in the political arena, somebody who could cost them in the voting booths at the polls and elsewhere. And of course, I'm talking about this information that James Reynolds possesses regarding Hamilton's affair with his wife. Let's go ahead and listen to this number. It's called "Say No to This," and it refers essentially to that little figure, the conscience that we all hear speaking to us inside our heads, telling us, cautioning us against behavior which we know is not beneficial, not salubrious, whether it means turning away that second piece of cake, or in this case, turning down this offer from the very nubile and attractive, I suppose he must have found her attractive, Maria Reynolds. So say no to this is what Hamilton is thinking to himself, and yet he simply cannot. So here's our segue. Notice the musical style here. Slow, sexy. What would it sound like if you were a composer and you were going to write music that had to do with this, salacious affair we're talking about? How would that sound? Once again, the brilliance of Miranda is on full display here. He uses a combination of chords that are mostly involving the dominant ninth chord and the half diminished chord. Now, most of you are perhaps thinking, what on earth does that mean? Well, these are chords that have historical ties to what is generally referred to as in the music scholarship as the erotic side of music. And this dates back to the late 1800s and the Impressionist composers like, for example, Claude Debussy. So these chords that you might find in the late Impressionist piece make their way into this and actually flavor most of the dish here in this next number. It's actually a very clever move on the composer's part. Here's Say No to This.
There's nothing like summer in the city. Someone under stress meets someone looking pretty. There's trouble in the air, you can smell it. And Alexander's by himself. I'll let him tell it.
I hadn't slept in a week, I was weak, I was awake. You've never seen a bastard orphan more in need of a break. Longing for Angelica, missing my wife. That's when Miss Mariah Reynolds walked into my life. She said,
I know you are a man of honor. I'm so sorry to bother you at home, but I don't know where to go, and I came here all alone.
She said,
my husband's doing me wrong, beating me, cheating me, mistreating me. Suddenly he's up and gone. I don't have the means to go on.
So I offered her a loan, I offered to walk her home. She said,
you're too kind, sir.
I gave her $30 that I had socked away. She lived a block away. She said,
this one's mine, sir.
Then I said, well, I should head back home. She turned red, she led me to a bed, let her legs spread and said,
stay.
Hey.
Hey.
That's when I began to pray, Lord, show me how to say no to this. I don't know how to say no to this. Oh my God, she looks so helpless. And her body's saying, hell yes. No, show me how to say no to this. I don't know how to say no to this. In my mind, I'm trying to go. Then her mouth is on mine, and I don't say no, no, say no to this. 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 I wish I could say that was the last time I said that last time. It became a pastime. A month into this endeavor, I received a letter from a Mr. James Reynolds. Even better, it said,
Dear sir, I hope this letter finds you in good health and in a prosperous enough position to put wealth in the pockets of people like me, down on their luck. You see, that was my wife who you decided to. Uh-oh, you made the wrong sucker a cuckold, so time to pay the piper for the pants you unbuckled. And hey, you can keep seeing my whole wife if the price is right. If not, I'm telling your wife.
I hit the letter and I raced to a place, screamed, I'll cut you in the face. She said,
no, sir.
Dressed apologetic, a mess. She looked pathetic, she cried.
Please don't go, sir.
So what's your full story? You said
I don't know about any letters.
Stop crying, goddammit, get up.
I didn't know any better.
I am ruined.
Please don't leave me.
I am helpless. How could I do this?
Just give him what he wants and you can have
I don't
me.
want you.
Whatever he
I don't
wants,
want you.
if you pay, you can stay.
Lord, show me how to say no to this. I don't know how to say no to this, but the situation's helpless. And her body's screaming, hell yes. Lord, show me how to say no to this. How can I say no to this? There is nowhere I can go. When her body's on mine, I do not say no. Yes. Say no to this. I don't say no to this. There is nowhere I can go.
So?
Nobody needs to know.
Now that's not the end of this scene. There's a really important number that comes next. We're not going to have time to get to it today. I've got two numbers planned for you. But let's reflect on what we heard. Did you notice that the style that I mentioned incorporates elements of jazz, but also hip hop with this impressionistic harmony? Did you notice those harp arpeggios in the middle when the full company is singing "Say No to This, Say No to This" in harmony? I think it's very suggestive. There have been some who have posited that Miranda meant for this whole scene to sort of mirror a sexual act with a sort of a preamble that starts slow and seductively and then reaches a sort of a climactic pulse and then finally dies down. I don't know that we need to go into details there, but I think it's a strong argument to be made. I also think there's a strong argument to be made that Hamilton sings very specific words and Miranda gives him these words, and it's not a coincidence. For example, did you notice at times he says, the situation's helpless? And he repeats that, the situation's helpless, and her body's saying, hell yes. When he says helpless, if you listen very closely, you'll hear Mariah Reynolds echo him and say helpless. And she mirrors the exact melodic pattern, although there's so much going on, it's tough to pick it out. She mirrors the exact melodic pattern of Eliza when Eliza sings her big blockbuster number in Act 1. And what is Eliza's big number in Act 1, the 10th song in the show? Well, many of you remember, it is in fact called Helpless. So there's a lot of interesting callbacks, and this recursive technique, which we've talked about, has come back so many times already. But we've got 2 numbers left to go. And I want to talk now about the Reynolds pamphlet, which comes very late in Act 2. But to understand the Reynolds pamphlet, before we listen to it, again, we're going to want to talk about it. So what's going on in the Reynolds pamphlet? I mentioned that Hamilton wrote all about this affair and he set it down, but I didn't tell you why he would do that. And I think that's a question every one of us is probably thinking. Why, if someone had an affair like this, and you could keep it hush-hush, or at the very least, if you wanted to be straightforward and forthright and candid and honest and true to your spouse, then maybe you would tell them. But why on earth would you write a pamphlet, a voluminous text of more than 90 pages, articulating all the details of this very sordid affair? I think that's a really good question to ask. Well, to understand it, we have to understand exactly what was going on at this point in Hamilton's life. First of all, he is going to be contending more and more. The rivalry between he and Aaron Burr is heating up. Burr is going to run for Senate in New York. He's going to win a Senate seat by defeating, of all people, if you can imagine it, Hamilton's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler. So his political prospects are grim. He says to Mariah Reynolds, in fact, in the song we just listened to, I am ruined. And he was right. That was a very prophetic statement. His political career was essentially torpedoed by this ill-advised affair he had with this young woman. By the way, as a final footnote to this discussion of the Reynolds affair itself, the scholarship is not exactly in agreement on exactly what transpired in this relationship. We really only know what Alexander put to paper, but there are some scholars, for example, Julian Boyd, who wrote a great biography of Thomas Jefferson. I would surmise that the library probably has a copy, suggests that there may be a lot more to the story than what we're led to believe in Hamilton's writing. So, or perhaps a lot less to the story. I'll leave that for those who are curious to investigate. We'll leave it there for now and revisit the question of why on earth would this guy write a 90-page tome explaining this affair? Well, it has to do with his sense of honor, as warped and twisted as that was. How could a man who had such a turgid affair have any sense of honor? Well, he did have a sense of honor, not with respect to his own fidelity to his wife, but specifically with respect to his role as a public figure, and more specifically as an agent of the government and a representative of the people. And what happened was, remember I told you he had been paying out sums to James Reynolds, and then James Reynolds was arrested, and James Reynolds going to implicate Hamilton in this embezzlement scandal. Well, Hamilton is horrified that he's been implicated here. In fact, a lot of this was fomented by James Madison and especially Thomas Jefferson, who found out about the scandal, sat on the information for several years, and then when it was politically expedient for them, they released these details to try to stir up antipathy and antagonism towards Hamilton. So there's a lot that's baked into this pie, and we're not going to have time to get to everything. But the basic story, distilled down to its essence, is this. Hamilton was afraid that he was going to be labeled as an embezzler, and it was more important for him to humiliate his wife and family and destroy his prospects as a future political contender and tell this story. It was more important for him to do that than to be perceived, even to have it rumored that he was an embezzler. This is so weird, so utterly bizarre, I think, to most listeners and most people who read the book. But there you have it. So let's listen to the Reynolds pamphlet, and then we'll go on to the last song, which takes us into not only the fate of the various characters, but the narration, which is given by Eliza Hamilton. So here is the Reynolds pamphlet, one of the strangest, musically speaking, one of the strangest songs in the entire show. But that stands to reason that it should be strange given what is going on in the drama. I've referred to a few times. This is Angelica's tune, and it usually sounds just before she enters the scene or sings. Now, this is another one that directly segues into the next number, but I love this sort of harmonic bleed effect. If you notice, there's a sense of polytonality at the end. We get this theme, which many of you are associating with the next song, which is Burn. And he puts this B minor theme over a C minor bass. In other words, it gives us this crashing, really, really disturbing dissonance. It's a very clever effect. We also have to admire some of the text here. This, you can't help but chuckle here. Hey, at least he was honest with our money. And that's really what it came down to. Hamilton was so worried, not that he would be arrested or tried, but just that it would be rumored that he was associated with some kind of financial impropriety, that he decided to humiliate himself and his family and put his wife through the kind of torment that comes with the revelation of such details. Some would say a very selfish move. Hamilton would justify it by saying that he needed to do it to sort of save face. And we know what his attitude was. And I think by today's standards, it would be considered a fairly preposterous move. But there you have it, one of the strangest artifacts in the history of the American political canon, the Reynolds pamphlet. By the way, that whole pamphlet can be read. All you need to do is plug it into Google and you can find the text of it. And again, admire Alexander's prose. All right, we have time to get to one more. Therefore, we're going to go to the last song in the show. This is after Hamilton has been shot and killed in Weehawken, New Jersey. He did not die instantly, by the way. It took him until the next day to expire. But when he did expire, he wasn't a particularly old man. Hamilton was born, most scholars agree, probably in 1756. So if we went to 1806, that would make him 50 years old. So he was not quite 50 years old. He would have been in his late 40s at the time of his death. What about Eliza? Well, Eliza is the narrator here, and where I paused it now, she has one of the most dramatic songs in the show. The show ends with her singing, but before that, she sings the song Burn, where she talks about burning her correspondences with Alexander. The scholars have written much about why she did this, and they think that it has to do with a lot more, or perhaps a lot, something completely different than what's suggested in the show. The show makes it clear that she feels so betrayed by the perfidy of her husband that she burns the letters. But without getting into it, we'll come now to the postlude. Whatever happened between these as husband and wife duo, what we're going to get now is a sort of a retrospective reflection sung from the perspective of Eliza Hamilton in the distant future. Now, how distant into the future? Well, those of you who know Eliza's story know that she lived well into the 19th century. She's going to live all the way into the middle of the century. She'll die at the age of 97 years old. So she was about the same age as her husband. I think she was born a year later, but she lives a half a century longer than he did. It's quite remarkable. Of course, today, living to 97, I think, is considered several standard deviations right of the bell curve. Back then, it would have been exceptionally rare. So let's listen to this last number. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? I see Anne. Thank you so much, Anne, for that very, very thoughtful comment in chat. Thank you. I invite you and everybody else to go ahead and check me out on Facebook, Dr. Gil Harel Lectures. You can just plug that into Facebook, Dr. Gil Harel Lectures. Throw me a like, and you can follow me as I spread the various, the joy of analyzing various musical works from various musical styles, including Baroque oratorio, contemporary musical theater, chamber music, symphonic repertoire, opera. Really, there's no genre that I don't tackle, really. I think with the exception of like maybe country music. Anyway, so all it's going to take is for me to get into a musical that is written in a country style, and then I'll become a country music fan. I think many of us feel that way about rap and hip hop, where there's a certain aversion we profess to have for the idiom, and then we listen to Hamilton or In the Heights or something like that, and all of a sudden we become converts, right? All right, so the last number takes us well into the distant future. And so what we have are sort of the ghosts of all of these figures we've met in the drama singing to us. We hear from George Washington, we hear from Jefferson and Madison and Burr, but most of all, we hear from Eliza. Let's listen to this last number, Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story?
Let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You have no control.
Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?
President Jefferson, I'll give him this. His financial system is a work of genius. I couldn't undo it if I tried. And I tried.
Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?
President Madison, he took our country from bankruptcy to prosperity. I hate to admit it, but he doesn't get enough credit for all the credit he gave us.
Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?
Every other founding father story gets told. Every other founding father gets to grow old.
And when you're gone, who remembers your name? Who keeps your flame? Who tells your story?
Who tells your story? Who tells your story?
Put myself back in the narrative. I stop wasting time on tears. I live another 50 years. It's not enough. I interview every soldier who fought by your side.
She tells our story.
I try to make sense of your thousands of pages of writings. You really do write, but you're running out of time. I rely on Angelica. While she's alive, we tell your story. She is buried in Trinity Church near you. When I needed her most, she was right on time. And I'm still not through. I ask myself, what would you do if you had more time? The Lord in his kindness, he gives me what you always wanted. He gives me more time. I raise funds in D.C. for the Washington Monument.
She tells my story.
I speak out against private orphanage in New York City.
The orphanage.
I helped raise hundreds of children. I get to see them growing up.
The orphanage.
In their eyes I see you, Alexander. I see you every time. And when my time is up, have I done enough? Will they tell your story? Oh, I can't wait to see you again. It's only a matter of time.
Will they tell your story? Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? Will they tell your story? Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?
There's something powerfully poignant about this finale. It doesn't end with the pageantry and glitz and glamour of a big ensemble number that it might, right, with big percussion and brass and the like. Instead, what we get is an a cappella ending that eventually converges with all the voices singing in unison. There's no harmony at the end. It's just that one note. And in terms of the lyrics, there's a lot to cover, but perhaps the most interesting thing here is when Eliza says the orphanage, and there's this pause, and then all of a sudden the company comes in and fills out the harmony there. The orphanage, the orphanage. And the orphanage makes a whole lot of sense, because what's the very first line in this musical? How does a bastard, comma, orphan, son of a Horn Scotsman? Again, how does a bastard, comma, orphan? So here's this woman who 50 years later, you know, she's shuffling off the mortal coil, and presumably that's when this narration takes place. What's the last thing she tenderly reflects on? The orphanage, which of course you can imagine that the very concept of an orphanage would have been wont to bring a tear to her eye, and something she would have worked on with great conviction, which we know historically the real Eliza Hamilton did. It's a tremendous way to end the musical, and it takes us back to the very first number of the show in a couple of ways. It raises that question that I raised last week. When we asked ourselves, Hamilton, we know his face is on the $10 bill. We know he's an important figure in the inchoate, nascent phase of American politics and American government. But perhaps we should be asking ourselves, why don't we know more about him? Why doesn't he figure more prominently, or at least until the Chernow biography and the musical, didn't feature very prominently at all? And Eliza here is singing, who tells your story? And the answer here, as it's related to us in the musical at the end, is that Burr is the one who's singing, right? And Burr says his enemies destroyed his rep, America forgot him. But by the end of the musical, now the narrative has been taken over by Eliza, who interviewed every soldier who fought with him, who raised money for the DC monument, and of course, established the very first private orphanage in New York City. And that's the new narrative, the new perspective that we as audience members get. So this is a very sort of, it's a very tender, lyrical, and poignant way to end the musical, but it's a very thought-provoking way to end the musical as well. As a footnote, before we take some questions, I just want to say that this show will always have a very, very special place for me, because it was the first thing I worked on in the pandemic era when we were allowed to come back to campus. And credit has to be given to the administrators at NVCC who allowed me and my intrepid group of 10 students to meet on campus starting last August, if you can believe it, to sing on campus together at a time when very few people were doing it. Very few people are doing it now. And we put together, the first thing we looked at was music from Hamilton. And I'll never forget working on it over the summer with a few very precocious students who wanted to get a jump start on it. And we've put on November 20th last semester, a really special performance, a musical review class that did a performance of excerpts from Hamilton. And I think for me, the musical will always be interwoven, intertwined with this particular period, which in many ways we would like to forget, but in other ways is unforgettable. And in some ways, there's a silver lining to it. And for me, Hamilton is that one of those silver linings, at least. So, all right, let me go ahead and get to some of these questions. Stephen says in chat, Watch the video 3 times your presentation puts in. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. Go ahead and I hope we can connect. Go ahead and throw me a like on Facebook if you're on Facebook. Dr. Gil Harel Lectures. Ina asks, when we get to the discussion of the last song, could you explain why, the famous gasp. Yeah, I'm glad you asked about this, Ina. The famous gasp. If you watch the performance, Philip Asu, who plays Eliza Hamilton, famously gasps, and people have wondered about that and puzzled about why the actress puts on, is it her sort of staring into death? Is this the last gasp of her life? Is it the death rattle that takes her just before she joins Alexander on the other side? I think that's the prevailing theory, that this is sort of her connecting her corporeal, physical presence on earth as she's departing, as she's leaving, as she's shuffling off the mortal coil and going to join her husband. But I think also this is very typical in the realm of drama. To some degree, we want the audience to be somewhat in the dark. You don't have to spell out every single thing. My students are working this semester on Pippin, which some of you saw me a couple of nights ago talk about for the Darien Library. And Pippin's a musical that doesn't have a happy ending. It doesn't have a clear ending. And there's many questions that are raised. And I think, this is important. We should ask ourselves questions after the work concludes. Any great work of art should pique our curiosity, right? Kathy, how much of the Hamilton musical text comes from the actual writings? Great question, Kathy. Not a whole lot, but there are definitely quotations there are interpolations and paraphrases, but in terms of direct quotations, they're not much. You named the big one, which is in Washington's farewell speech and also in the Reynolds pamphlet. You're right, there is some there as well. James Reynolds' letter is read verbatim at first. The whole, hello, sir, I hope this finds you in good health. Margot asks, is there a recording of the performance of Hamilton excerpts with your students? Margot, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and put that in chat for everybody. It starts, let's see. Yeah, okay, let me go ahead and share screen so you can see what we're looking at here. I actually have it on my screen right now, and I'll share the link for everyone. So these are the intrepid 10 students who took to the stage. You could see socially distanced with their masks on. And there's me reading off my iPad. This was in an empty theater that normally seats close to 800, and there was nobody there except for a skeleton crew of maybe 5 people broadcasting the show. And if you go down and go into the comments, or the description rather, you'll see the timestamps for everybody. So we did, I don't know, 10 or 11 songs from the musical as part of this review, and it was really, really special. I was just thrilled with how my students took to it. Let me go ahead and put that link in chat for you. I'm going to send this to all attendees, and there it is. Yes, and if I can just put in a quick cheap plug, Kayla, I'm going to just tell people that on April 29th, we are, that is to say, the students at NVCC and the music and theater departments will be putting on a performance of Pippin, which is going to be broadcast on Showtix for you. And if you follow me on Facebook, I'll have that link ready for you. All right, more questions. Let's see, Rania, I hope I pronounced that right. Can you say more about why else Eliza might have burned her correspondence with Hamilton? Is there anything you might want to add to show color the forgiveness that Eliza extends to Hamilton? Yeah. So for those of you who have seen the traditional staging of this in the Broadway version, you'll notice that the scene is Eliza is depicted sort of sitting in the dark, and they use this special paper that Broadway contrived that burns very slowly and at a very specific pace so that she could time it with the music. Now, why else would she have burned the correspondences? Let me give you some theories. I'll give you one theory that it's not so radical, but some people have subscribed to it. And first of all, I should point out that they're not the first pair of lovers to burn correspondences, right? That happens quite a bit. In fact, one of the most famous examples of that in music history is between Robert and Clara Schumann. Not Robert and Clara Schumann, but between Clara Schumann and Johannes Brahms. And there's a whole story there, and that would have been in the late 1890s. So why else would Eliza? Well, there are some scholars who have posited theories, some of which are, I have to say, quite out there. But one is that she may have simply been embarrassed to have written such flowery things about a man who wound up, essentially committing this act of treachery, this act of betrayal, and then the extra step of humiliating her by writing all about it. So I think that's probably one of the more obvious ones. I don't know that there's one that holds water that all scholars are in agreement on. But I agree that it's the fact that it ends with Eliza singing about her deep reverence for this man who left her 50 years before she herself would succumb and die. It's pretty remarkable. Michael says, too amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. I hope I hope everyone's able to come to subsequent lectures with the New Canaan Library and elsewhere. The New Canaan Library, I was telling Anthony last week, my very first library engagement when I moved to Connecticut was with the New Canaan Library. So in much in the same way that Hamilton will always be very special to me, the New Canaan Library will always be special to me in that sense. Maddie asks, did George and Martha Washington burn? I have read that, but I'm not an authority on the George Washington, Martha Washington marriage or even on Washington's biography. So I know he was born in the same year as Franz Joseph Haydn, and he died in the very late 1790s. So he wasn't around to see his former aide-de-camp get shot and killed in 1804, but possibly. I'm going to do what every good scholar should do, Rania and Maddie, and I'm going to say, you know what, I'm going to have to read up on that to give you a really good answer, because I don't have a great answer right now, but it's conceivable. Wouldn't surprise me. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you to everybody who joined us this evening. I hope to see you guys soon. And Kayla, thank you to you and the New Canaan Library for continuing to put on and to invite, continue to put on all sorts of programs, and specifically for inviting me to do this two-part series. And I think, as we've seen over the last 2 weeks, this is really a piece that requires at least 2 nights. We could have done 4 or 10 or however many if we really wanted to.
Thank you so much, Gil. This was excellent, and it was being recorded tonight, so if you want to refer back to it, it'll be on the library's YouTube channel within the next day or so. But thank you for sharing the link of your students and for the Pippin information. I'm certainly going to check it out.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to the next one, folks. Until then, have a great evening and stay well and enjoy this lovely sunshine.
Thanks, Dr. Harel. Good night, everyone.